Have you ever fallen in love with a pattern for a pullover sweater, but wished it were a cardigan instead? In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll go over the basic concepts of how to approach converting a pattern for a pullover sweater into one for a cardigan. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen and use the chapter titles to guide you to the starting point of the desired section. Use the gear icon to slow down or speed up playback. Most contemporary sweater patterns will include a schematic, which is a line drawing that represents the outline of the sweater with key measurements indicated, such as the total length of the sweater, the width or circumference of it, the armhole depth, the sleeve length, that sort of thing. So the schematic represents how the sweater looks when it's lying flat on a table. So you'll see the back of the neck here. This part here represents the front neck. The front and back of the sweater are typically exactly the same length and width, so all of the dimensions for both of those can be illustrated in the one drawing. So this is a schematic for a pullover. If we wanted to turn this into a cardigan, the schematic would look exactly the same, except there would be a vertical line down the front center that bisects the front. This neck opening right here and this front opening right here represent the size of the knitting before the knitted button bands or neck ribbing have been knitted. So something that looks like this. So the two halves of the front are exactly the same size as the back before any of the button bands have been knitted or before the neck has been knitted. So this is a miniature sweater that has the same size neck opening, only it's a pullover, and the ribbing has been knitted in. So the opening gets smaller after the ribbing has been knit for the neck, and for the button bands, the front of the sweater will actually get a little bit larger once those button bands have been knit. So not all cardigans are designed in this way where you just have the pullover front and you just divide it in half, but frequently and perhaps even most often they are. If you wanted something with a really wide front band, then you would have to remove some of this front. But for something where the front bands are only going to be about an inch wide or inch and a quarter wide for an adult sweater, you would maintain those two halves just the same size as if it were a pullover. And then the button bands, once they were overlapped, would together add about an extra inch in width to the front, which is something that is not a bad idea when you are putting on a cardigan and you're wearing it over the top of something else. So if you are converting a pattern for a pullover that was originally intended to be knit flat and seamed like this one, you would knit the back of the sweater exactly the same when you were making the cardigan. But for the front, you're going to be working half of the stitches for one half of the cardigan and the other half of the front stitches for the other half. So if you had, say, 100 stitches originally for the entire front, this is the left front. It's the left as worn. For the left front, you'd be knitting stitches 1 through 50 back and forth. But for the right front, again, this is right as worn, you would be knitting stitches 51 to 100 back and forth in whatever the stitch pattern is that you're using. So if your pattern was originally knit flat, then the stitch pattern instructions are for flat knitting, and you don't have to convert them. You just have to know where stitch 50 would end and where stitch 51 would start if you had, say, 100 stitches. The armhole shaping is going to be the same for each of the armholes. Things get a little bit different at the neck, just very slightly different. When you're working a pullover and it's time to start the neck shaping, if you're working bottom up, you would start on a right side row. You'd work across all of the stitches that were going to be for the right shoulder, and then you would bind off a bunch of stitches for the base of the neck, and then you would continue until you got to the end of the row. And at this point, the right and left shoulders would be separated from each other, and they would be knit separately. So those instructions are going to be exactly the same once you've done the bind off for the neck. The shaping for each shoulder is going to be exactly the same. Where things are going to be a little different is on which row you're doing your bind off. When you are starting at this edge, and it would have been time in the pullover to start doing your bind offs on the center, on the left front, you're just going to work all the way across to the end of that row. And it isn't until you turn to work across the wrong side row, then you're going to do your bind off stitches. So if you originally had, say, 16 stitches across the base here, you'd have 8 bind off here and 8 bind off here. You'd just be dividing them up. But on this half of the cardigan, you're going to be doing them on a wrong side row because you're binding off at the start of a row. Where for this half of the cardigan, you will do your half of the bind off stitches for the pullover. You're going to be doing them here on a right side row. But after you've worked that right side row and wrong side row, in both cases, the neck shaping is going to be exactly as it originally was in the pullover, because these two parts are separate, just as they were in the original. If your original sweater was knit in the round, if your pullover was knit in the round, you are going to no longer have a beginning of the round. You are going to have a beginning of the row. And in a sweater that is worked in the round, typically the beginning of the round is in line with the center of the sleeve and underarm. It's either on this side of the sweater or this side. And so that has to shift. It's going to be shifting to the center front, which means any markers or anything like that are going to be shifted in order to mark where the placement of the sleeves or the underarms or whatever. Those are going to be in different places than they were when the beginning of the round was here. The next thing you have to be aware of is, because you are not going to be working in the round, you're going to be working back and forth. So you can still do seamless construction, but you're going to be working in rows. And that means that whatever the stitch pattern is has to be converted from in the round knitting to flat knitting. So I do have a series of videos that I did this past winter on converting instructions for flat knitting into instructions for in the round knitting. So the concepts are still the same. If your stitch pattern is presented to you in a chart, that will make things much easier. You just have to read the chart differently for flat knitting than you do for in the round knitting. There is one more option, and that is to knit the sweater exactly as it was written for a pullover, and then cut the knitting up the front in order to open it up, and then knit up your button bands. So that's a technique that is used not only to create cardigans, but also to create the actual armholes in traditional knitting of Norway and also the Shetland Islands, Fair Isle knitting. Those types of sweaters have very basic shaping like this, and so the whole body is just knit in a tube, and then you cut down. And those sweaters tend to be knit in stranded color work, so it's easier to see the right side of the work. But steeks can be done in other types of stitch patterns and other types of shapings. It's leveling up a little bit. There are a lot of tutorials out there that will help you with this. I don't happen to have any on my YouTube channel, but that is an option. One other thing to think about before you even start knitting is what sort of ribbing you're going to be using and what you're going to do to maintain symmetry on either side of the front opening. So for my little sample sweater, I'm using a Knit 2 Purl 2 ribbing, which has a 4-stitch repeat. But Once I have the button bands in place, what I want to see on each side is a knit two. I don't want to see one knit. I don't want to see knits on one side and purls on the other. I want them to be symmetrical. So with a 4-stitch repeat and wanting the symmetry, I can actually have a multiple of 4 stitches that I have for the ribbing. I started the edging with a knit 3, and then I went to purl 2, knit 2, etc. And then I ended with a knit 3. And what that does is that when I need to pick up stitches for my bands, I'm going to lose that first column of stitches and that last column of stitches. They end up on the inside of the work. So by starting with a knit 3 and ending with a knit 3, I have that symmetry of knit 2 on either side. If I were going to use knit 1, purl 1 ribbing, I would need an odd number of stitches, and I could have the symmetry so that I could see a purl column on each side or a knit column on each side. You might need to play around with your ribbing repeats based on the stitch counts that you need for the body and what will work for the ribbing in order to have that symmetry. But keep in mind that you can always adjust your stitch count as you transition from the body to the ribbing if you're knitting top down, or from the ribbing to the body as you're knitting bottom up. So if you had an odd number of stitches in order to make the symmetry work for your ribbing, you could adjust your stitch count somewhere on one of the pieces, on the two fronts or in the back, up or down a stitch if you needed to, in order to get the stitch count that you needed for the body. I repeated this symmetry up at my neckband. I still have the knit 2, purl 2 up there, and I have the knit 3 at the edge here and over here, and you can see that once I picked up the button band, I have the knit 2 here. I repeated it again for the button bands. I started and ended with a knit 3, which you can't see the first and last one because those weren't picked up. The first and last stitches were cast on with a backwards loop, which meant they weren't attached to the fabric, but they were attached to the other ribbing, and it caused that stitch to roll. And that helps to fill in that little dip that you can get along that ribbing. So for me, having that same process for all 3 of the pieces, where I started and ended with a knit 3, gave me perfect symmetry. I'll link to a video that I have on this process. I'll link to that above and also down in the video description. This video was an introduction to the concepts behind converting a pullover pattern into a cardigan and how to go about making that conversion, depending on how the original pattern was constructed. These concepts are also useful to understand when designing a sweater from scratch. If you'd like to see a deeper dive into any of these concepts discussed in today's video, or if you have suggestions for other videos you'd like to see in the future, you can let me know down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.